Hello, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Today, we're going to talk about billionaires influencing politics. We've often talked about their influence in politics. And since that's such an important feature of our political system, this is not the last time that we're going to talk about their influence in politics. It's appropriate to start off here today with Bernie Sanders. Because Bernie, of course, is very much aware of the influence of money in politics. He frequently talks against it. And here he is again. He speaks at a rally in Los Angeles on October 27, 2022. But he also just wrote a Fox News op-ed concerning that influence. Sanders says the true economic crisis we face is corporate greed, and a Republican Congress would make it worse. He says, this is by Jake Johnson. Today, November 4th. Entering the final stretch of the midterm campaign, Senator Bernie Sanders warned in a Fox News op-ed that the United States is in the midst of an economic crisis caused by corporate greed, that a Republican-controlled Congress would make a bad situation worse. Quote, during this campaign, my Republican colleagues talk a lot about inflation, and they are right to do so. Sanders, the Independent from Vermont, wrote, over the last year, Americans have become sick and tired of paying outrageously high prices for food, gas, healthcare, prescription drugs, housing, and other necessities, unquote. Quote again, unfortunately, most Republicans completely ignore the underlying causes of inflation. Bernie continued, noting that, quote again, a major reason for inflation that too few people talk about is, quote again, the unprecedented level of corporate greed that we are now seeing, unquote. According to a recent study, nearly 54%, and I'm still quoting from Bernie, of the rise in inflation is directly attributable to the astronomical increase in corporate profit margins, unquote. And the senator added, quote again, in America today, while the working class struggles to put food on the table, fill up their gas tanks, and heat their homes, corporate profits are at a 70-year high. Sanders' op-ed in the right-wing outlet came as Republicans continue to message aggressively on high inflation, falsely putting all the blame on the Biden administration, and Democrats scramble to counter GOP attacks with blunt criticism of corporate profiteering, something Sanders and other progressives have been urging them to do for weeks, with control of Congress at stake. President Joe Biden and Democratic candidates have also highlighted Republican plans to attack Social Security and Medicare, as well as their proposal to permanently cut taxes for the rich, which would exacerbate inflation. Quote, you don't reduce inflation by giving tax breaks to billionaires and cutting benefits for the elderly, the sick, the children, and the poor, Bernie said on Friday. He wrote on Friday. Quote, you combat inflation by taking on corporate greed, passing a windfall profits tax. You combat inflation by taking on the power of the insurance companies, the drug companies, the fossil fuel industry, the giant food companies, and lowering the outrageously high costs of healthcare, prescription drugs, gas, and groceries. Sanders, who caucuses with the Democrats, has been vocally sounding the alarm about the party's leadership, inadequate economic messaging ahead of the November 8th midterms, warning that a failure to push back on the GOP's inflation attacks, acknowledge the struggle of low-wage workers, and offer bold solutions to voters would be, quote, a political malpractice. In an interview with The Guardian published Friday, Sanders said he is, quote, very much worried that, quote again, Democrats have not done a good enough job of reaching out to young people and working class people and motivating them to come out and vote in, come out to vote in this election, unquote. The senator is currently wrapping up a 5-state tour aimed at boosting voter turnout, with his final 3 stops coming in the battlegrounds of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Quote, people are hurting. You got 60% of our people living paycheck to paycheck, and for many workers, they're falling further behind as a result of inflation. And the senator said, and quote again, oil company profits are soaring. Food company profits are soaring. Drug company profits are soaring. Corporate profits are at an all-time high. The rich are getting much richer. And Democrats have not got to make that their message, unquote. Hope that's not the whole message. The true quote, the truth is that about half of inflationary cost increases are a result of corporate greed, unquote. So if people can't afford to fill up their gas tanks, if they can't afford food, if they can't afford their prescription drugs, what Democrats should be explaining to them is why that is so, unquote. Sanders is hardly alone in warning Democrats and warning that Democrats have been too slow to adjust their economic messaging on inflation, which has polled as voters' most pressing concern. In a column on Thursday, the American Prospect's Harold Meyerson lamented that Biden's endorsement of an overwhelmingly popular windfall profits tax if oil companies refuse to bring down prices came 8 days before the election and well after millions of Americans had already cast their ballots. By the way, I was lamenting that myself just yesterday in one of my streams. In the closing weeks of the campaign, Democrats are finally recasting their messaging to the price of gas, the price of drugs, the Republican threats to Social Security and Medicare, and the like. Perhaps this will work. My fear, however, is that it may well be too late. That is my fear as well. Okay, that sort of sets the stage. Let's look at a second piece. Oh, by the way, so that's a very important statement by Bernie, especially in the context of the following facts. This is another Common Dreams article. That's a picture of Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal, Palantir Technologies, and Founders Fund. Holds $100 bills as he speaks during the Bitcoin 2022 conference at Miami Beach Convention Center on April 7th, 2022 in Miami. This piece is called Drowning Our Democracy. U.S. billionaires have pumped nearly $900 million into the midterms. This is by Jessica Corbett of Common Dreams on November 3rd. With under a week until the U.S. midterm elections, Americans for Tax Fairness revealed Thursday that billionaires have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into campaigns this cycle, largely to benefit Republican candidates. A torrent of billionaire cash is drowning our democracy, declared Frank Clemente, executive director of Americans for Tax Fairness, ATF. Quote, money talks when it comes to influencing candidates and winning elections, and the loudest voices by far are billionaires pushing for lower taxes so they can accumulate even greater wealth and have even more power and influence, unquote. If we're going to have an economy that works for everyone, billionaires need to start paying their fair share. And if we're going to have a democracy that works for everyone, we need to greatly curb the influence of billionaire money in our politics. We absolutely do, of course, but based on an analysis of the Federal Election Commission data from Open Secrets, ATF found that through the end of September, 465 American billionaires have pumped over $881 million into federal midterm races, with the top 20 donor households giving 73% of the contributions, or collectively more than $643 million. Pushing that into a national context, ATF tweeted that billionaires representing 0.00002% of the American population, but they're responsible for 7.4% of all political donations so far this cycle. That, of course, is the way in which the oligarchy controls our politics. By the way, their contributions are 27 times more than they contributed before Citizens United was decided. By the time this cycle is over, their donations could climb to $1 billion for the midterms. And here's a graph of contributions before the Citizens United decision and then afterwards. And believe me, that decision was wrongly decided. If you go into the opinion that was written in 2010, Anthony Kennedy, but Justice Kennedy opined that there would be very little influence from the dollars of rich people in campaigns because of this particular decision. He poo-pooed the likely influence when he was justifying the Supreme Court making this particular decision. Well, in 2010, the contributions amounted to $32 million. In 2014, they amounted to $232 million. In 2018, they amounted to $611 million. And in 2022, these years, of course, that are mentioned are midterm years. In 2022, 881 million, okay, and counting. That is, I guess, what Anthony Kennedy meant by a very slight influence on elections. That's the evidence that this decision was wrongly decided. The influence of money in politics was too great before the decision, but after the decision, it has enabled pretty much total control of the Congress by these really huge amount of monies coming from the billionaires, going through various intermediaries, and ending up in the pockets of the candidates. Of course, the candidates are controlled by the money. $881 million, getting close to $1 trillion versus $32 trillion. How can the integrity of the candidates stand against that kind of thing? Going back to the article, but wait, there's more. 3/4 of that 881 million is coming from just 20 billionaire households. And 59% of it is going to Republican PACs and candidates. Top donors include Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, Ken Griffin, Jeffrey Yass, Peter Thiel, and George Soros. I'm sure you've heard of Soros, but how many people have heard of the Uihleins, Ken Griffin, Jeffrey Yass, Peter Thiel? You have to study these matters to know these names, to know the identity of these people who are influencing elections. In these midterms, Sam Bankman-Fried, who's a recent cryptocurrency billionaire, he's made $17.3 billion in cryptocurrency. He's given $39,747,600 to Democratic candidates or to super PACs that were donating to Democratic candidates in this campaign. He gave $27 million to the Protect Our Future PAC, $6 million to the House Majority PAC, which is Nancy Pelosi's PAC, and $2 million to the GMI PAC. I don't even know what the GMI PAC is. Stephen Schwartzman, who's worth $28.5 billion, contributed $33,301,058, but to Republican organizations that then turned around and contributed to congressional candidates. Now, Larry Ellison, same deal. He spent about $31 million. Peter Thiel, about $30 million. Patrick and Shirley Ryan, $26 million. Diane Hendricks, $23 million roughly. And Michael and Susan Bloomberg contributed $22 million to Democratic sources. And there are more billionaires who gave enough to be mentioned here. I'm not going to go through all their names. The total of the top 20 billionaire families, households, was 643,434,083. And total billionaire contributions, once again, 881,210,069 and counting. The group's report highlights how unprecedented the findings are, explaining that the 881 million was already a 44% increase in billionaire contributions over the entire 2018 midterm cycle, which totaled 611 million based on an earlier analysis by the ATF, the Americans for Tax Fairness, once again. So, we have very huge amounts of money coming in. And that is affecting our elections greatly and blocking the passage of all manner of legislation that these donors do not like. This cycle, Republican candidates are benefiting from roughly 75% of all single candidate super PAC spending. The funding for these PACs often comes almost exclusively from billionaires. The Wisconsin Truth PAC was created to re-elect Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin. The Saving Arizona PAC was largely funded by billionaire Peter Thiel in support of his former employee, Blake Masters. The Project Ohio Values PAC, another teal-back group for another former employee, J.D. Vance. And then there's 34N22, which is named for the college jersey of former professional football player Herschel Walker, who was trying to unseat Senator Warnock. Those races, along with closely watched contests in Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, will help determine the makeup of the currently split Senate, in which Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris officially breaks tie votes, but the filibuster gives Republicans an effective veto over most bills. And of course, who has a veto on what they support and what they don't support? These billionaires. The Republicans are also working to take control of the House of Representatives, which is now narrowly held by Democrats for the final 2 years of Joe Biden's first term. If even one chamber flips, that is appealing to a certain number of donors who are not looking forward to having one-party control. Ken Gross, a former FEC counsel, now at the law firm Aiken Gump, told Bloomberg they're just as happy to have a stalemate and no legislative action. Now, the U-Lines have donated $67 million, by the way, to Republican PACs and candidates so far this election cycle. Diane Hendricks has donated $22.6 million. A lot of that is going to help to re-elect Ron Johnson. Jeffrey Yass, the richest man in Pennsylvania, has managed to avoid $1 billion in taxes in recent years. Is it any wonder he puts his millions towards electing those who are committed to cutting taxes for billionaires and stopping the IRS from auditing the rich? The ATF reports that more than a quarter, 243 million of the billionaire contributions have gone to the 4 congressional super PACs of the House and Senate leadership of both parties. The 2 GOP PACs have vacuumed up 3/4, or 181 million in contributions. Most of this money is being spent on TV ads attacking opponents. As congressional candidates, along with those running for key state positions that could influence future elections, have campaigned this cycle on former President Donald Trump's big lie, quote unquote, that he won in 2020. Biden has framed the midterms as a crucial opportunity to safeguard U.S. democracy from MAGA extremists, which is a message he stressed in a Wednesday night speech. Make no mistake, democracy is on the ballot for us all, Biden warned. Quote again, you have the power. It's your choice. It's your decision. The fate of the nation, the fate of the soul of America lies where it always does with the people, in your hands, in your heart, and your ballot. Unquote. Well, it will only do that, though, if people come together to vote against those candidates who are not taking any of the big money from the PACs, the super PACs, the party committees, the corporations, and the richest people directly. If you vote for people taking any of this big money, you're contributing to the problem of oligarch control. That is what is going on. It demands voting against anyone who takes the big money. I notice Biden did not advocate for that. He did not make such a statement. If he did, he would be advising people to vote against people such as Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, most of the major committee chair people in the Congress, and so on. He says democracy is on the ballot for us all. He warns you have the power. It's your choice. It's your decision. The fate of the nation, the fate of the soul of America lies where it always does with the people, in your hands, in your heart, and your ballot. But he doesn't ask people to do what they would have to do to break the hold of the oligarchs on a nation. And that is to turn out of office the people who are taking all this money, who are making use of it for themselves and their followers to get elected, and who, in doing this, are binding themselves to the billionaires and to obedience to the billionaires. That is what is going on here. So one more piece. This one. This one is by a top economist at a major global bank. There's Jay Powell again. I've been showing him a lot in recent days. The title is Top Economist at Major Global Bank Says Corporate Profits Are Fueling Inflation. This article is by Jake Johnson again on November 3rd, who says the chief economist at the Global Investment Bank, the Union Bank of Switzerland, or UBS, the world's largest wealth manager, argued in an op-ed for the Financial Times on Wednesday that inflation in the United States is more a product of profits than wages, and criticized Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell for refusing to acknowledge that fact as he plows ahead with massive interest rate hikes. Powell's public remarks, quote, Powell's public remarks offer little insight into how he expects higher rates to tame inflation, unquote. Paul Donovan of UBS Global Wealth Management wrote just ahead of the Fed's latest interest rate increase of 75 basis points. Quote again from Paul Donovan. This is the current inflation story. Companies have passed higher costs on to customers, but they have also taken advantage of circumstances to expand profit margins. The broadening of inflation beyond commodity prices is more profit margin expansion than wage cost pressures, unquote. Quote again, despite negative real wages, consumers have carried on consuming. Consumers seem to be buying stories that seem to justify price increases, but which really serve as cover for profit margin expansion. This unconventional inflation means higher unemployment and lower wages are not the only possible cure for it. Policy has more routes to lower inflation if the cause is about profits, unquote. Thus far, though, the Powell-led Federal Reserve has primarily used interest rate increases in its as yet unsuccessful effort to bring down inflation, even as critics warn that such an approach harms workers and risks a devastating recession without tackling the primary drivers of price increases. At his Wednesday press conference, Powell once again conceded that rate hikes don't directly affect, for the most part, food and energy prices, two major sources of inflation dictated by profit-seeking corporations such as Exxon, Chevron, and Pepsi. Quote, "We increased prices at the beginning of the fourth quarter based on what we knew at that point," unquote. Pepsi's chief financial officer said on the company's earnings call last month, quote, "And going forward with the investments that we've made in brands, I still think we're capable of taking whatever pricing we need," unquote. During his public appearance Wednesday, Powell wasn't asked a single question about the role corporate profiteering has played in causing high inflation, even as executives boast about their enormous pricing power. So progressive advocates and economists who have been spotlighting corporate America's inflationary profiteering for months seized on Donovan's Financial Times op-ed as further evidence that their data-driven argument is gradually piercing the mainstream, even as Powell ignores it. Quote, "Even a major bank's chief economist now admits that corporations are price gouging under the guise of inflation," the American Economic Liberties Project tweeted on Thursday. By the way, that organization is the one that Matt Stoller works at. He may even be behind that tweet. Christian Hallam, tax justice lead at Oxfam International, added that, quote, "skyrocketing profits are to blame for inflation," according to the chief economist at UBS Global Global Wealth Management. Quote again, "Maybe we should tax windfall profits instead of trying to create unemployment through interest rate hikes," Hallam suggested. So let's look at this, folks. Let's look at this. Here are the corporations, the large corporations, price gouging us, creating more than half of the inflation problem through their price gouging. Now, there are also supply chain issues. Demand, however, has very little to do with it. The reason why we know demand has very little to do with it is because rises in wages only account for 8% of the inflation. The rest is due primarily to price gouging and to supply chain problems. We know that. So look at the situation. We have the large corporations largely creating the inflation problem, which they and their allies then use to blame Joe Biden for not doing anything about the inflation problem, which then tends to facilitate the likely Republican victory after next Tuesday, because people are angry at the wrong person, angry at Joe Biden. And what does that do? That puts in the Republicans who will try to cut inflation while cutting the taxes of the very same people and institutions that did the most to create this inflation in the first place. Isn't that a sweet game? It's a sweet game that relies on lousy Democratic strategy in approaching this election, that also relies on the information poverty of the public, who cannot seem to link the idea of price gouging to the corporations and to inflation, and who can't seem to link that they're not going to get rid of inflation by putting the very people who have done the most to create that inflation back into power. Now, I'll back off this just a little bit because I don't want to let the Democrats off the hook. They started a war. Yes, I know people say the Russians marched into Ukraine. But a realistic look at the situation says that there was a coup in Ukraine replacing a government that was friendly to Russia with a government that was hostile to Russia and Russians living in Ukraine. That government then proceeded to oppress the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. That government also pushed hard for getting into NATO and creating another country on Russia's borders that was inside of NATO, and that could be a base for missiles which would be capable of hitting the Russian government in Moscow within a very few minutes, perhaps 3 minutes. That created a crisis of security for Russia, which they answered with their invasion, of Ukraine. That's what happened. When the war started, the West responded to the start of the war by also delivering a huge volume of economic sanctions. Those sanctions backfired and resulted in horrendous price hikes in the Western world, due to sanctions on Russian gas, sanctions on Russian grain that began to affect the price of energy all through Europe, also had an effect on here, also contributed to the rise in food prices all over the world. Now, it was the Democrats who chose to start that particular war, the war that started in 2014, not the invasion that started in 2022. The war that started in 2014, internal to Ukraine, that resulted in the deaths of 14,000 of Ukrainians. That's the backdrop for all this. And that accounts for some of the inflation right now, too. So the Biden administration is not completely innocent in this. Still, the major factor in the inflation is profiteering by the corporations, price gouging by the corporations. And if you vote against the Democrats this time around because you're angry at the inflation, your voting against them will only result in putting into power the very people who are most responsible for this inflation. And by the way, even though the Democrats started that 2014 war, the Trump administration did nothing to end it during their time in power. They let that oppression of the Russian speaking minority in Ukraine go on. So that has to be kept in mind too. There's blame to go around here. But to take the Republicans and put them into power when they're going to do nothing to stop the profiteering of the corporations, if you're a voter, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Okay, still a bit more to cover. What's happening to all those corporate profits? What's happening to all those corporate profits? Well, there's another piece that appeared in Common Dreams. The other piece gives us the answer to that question. This is from Common Dreams also. Title is This Graph Shows Where Surging Corporate Profits Increasingly Go. This is by Julia Conley on November 3rd. First of its kind analysis released Thursday shows how the amount of corporate profits being diverted to tax havens has skyrocketed in recent years, with nearly $1 trillion in global profits being stored in places where corporate giants don't have to pay taxes. The UN University World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNU-WIDER, studied corporate profits and profit shifting between 1975 and 2019, excuse me, finding that the diversion of massive profits is a relatively new phenomenon. In the 1970s, about 2% of profits made by corporations were shifted to tax havens such as the Bahamas, Anguilla, and Panama. By 2019, the amount had grown to 40%, with the use of corporate tax havens rising sharply in the past decade. Profit shifting has increased relentlessly, tweeted Ludwig Veer, the co-author of the study and the head of secretariat at the Danish Ministry of Finance. He investigated this in a new report that he wrote, okay, with Gabriel Zuckman, uh, who is an expert on poverty across the world and also, okay, on profits, very well known expert in these areas. Key finding: profit shifting has increased relentlessly. In 2019, nearly 1 trillion was shifted to havens. So the corporations get their tax breaks for one reason or another. And what do they do with that money? They do not reinvest in our economy or the economies of other Western nations. What they do is to siphon off their profits, including the part of their profits that's due to tax breaks, to tax havens that do not tax those profits at all. The shift of profits to corporate tax havens has contributed to the loss of 10% of corporate tax revenues, estimated the authors, including Veer and French economist Gabriel Zuckman. Quote, of course, if there had been no profit shifting, then countries may have chosen other policy paths. Some might have been less likely to cut their corporate tax rate and engage in the race to the bottom, unquote. The study reads, it illustrates, however, that the revenue losses caused by profit shifting are a quantitatively important aspect of the decline in effective corporate income tax rates globally since the 1970s. So, I'm going to stop there. That's where a lot of the corporate profits actually go. They don't go back into the economy, they just accumulate in the tax havens. So I thought you'd be interested in the final result of all this corporate tax greed that Bernie Sanders and many others have been talking about. I'm going to take a look now at your comments, if there are any. Nope, I don't have any comments. So I'm going to say that's all for now. I will be back at 9 p.m. this evening with another Empowering Democracy stream. And that stream oh, I'm sorry. I'll be back in just a few minutes, as a matter of fact. I'll be back at 3:15 and I'll be discussing Lying Dooms Democracy. That's an old blog of mine that I want to call your attention to. Because what lying in a democracy does is it perverts the policy course of a democracy and prevents the democracy from adapting to changing conditions. So I hope you find that topic interesting. And if you do, I will see you at 3:15. Please do not forget about my patreon.com account, patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And please do not forget about my buymeacoffee.com account, /Joe.Firestone. So thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, I'll see you at the next Empowering Democracy stream at 3:15. See you then.